Erev Tov, everybody. We have a double Parsha, which enables Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz to get back onto the same Parashat Shavua, and provides a challenge for Torah readers here in the diaspora, since it's pretty long, and gives us lots more essays of Nechama to choose from, and I picked out one for our learning enjoyment, which I'll share now. This is one in which we don't see much classic commentary, I would say, but we do get a glimpse of Nechama's kind of breadth of research in, I think, the interesting comment that she finds sort of a far-flung location. And again, it feels like one in which we, for all that she claims not to offer innovations and new commentaries, really feels like a kind of deep insight in reading on her part. So let's do it. Fear him not. The Israelites had begun the invasion of the approaches to the Promised Land. Right, this in this week's parasha, we should just note here in this point in Bamidbar, we've jumped over about 38 years, as is classically understood, from this probably from this past week's parasha Korach, which we imagine this rebellion may have happened at the beginning of the wilderness journeys, to this week's parasha Chukat, which takes us to the end of the wilderness journeys, and so now in the 39th year or so, the Israelites began their invasion of their approaches to the Promised Land, vanquishing in the process the mighty Sichon, king of the Amorites. As the pasuk here tells us about King Sichon, v'hu nilcham b'melech Moav harishon, v'yikach et kol artzo miado v'ad Arnon. An indication of how significant it was to defeat Sichon is the fact that he had already fought against the former king of Moab, taken all of his land, even to Arnon. Our sages describe the king of Moab and his kingdom as presenting a most difficult problem of conquest to the Israelites, but they succeeded in overcoming him and occupying his land from Arnon to Yabok. As we read on, it'll be, I think, it's curious exactly what the importance of this background narration is. The pasuk that Nechama is going to focus on is the one we're about to read, and so it's interesting to wonder why we needed this kind of back history. Then they turned their attention to the north. Vayifnu vayalu derech Bashan, they turned and went up by way of Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to the battle at Edrei. And the Lord said unto Moses, fear him not. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, al tira oto. We move from chapter 21, verse 26, to chapter 21, verses 33 to 34, in the middle of Parashat Chukat. This divine exhortation to Moses not to fear presents some difficulty. Okay, so she's going to zero in on her question, which is, what is the meaning of God saying to Moshe, don't be afraid of Og, the king of Bashan, against whom you're going out to do battle? Where do we find any hint in our chapter that Moses was afraid? Right, the implication being that if God is telling Moshe, don't be afraid, Moshe is afraid or has reason to be afraid. Should it then be argued that the Torah would not wish to record Moses' but mortal fears of flesh and blood out of respect for him? This suggestion is ruled out by the fact that we do have earlier on in the Pentateuch the following statement describing Moses' state of mind after he had slain the Egyptian, which is going to take us through kind of call a set of possible answers and address each of them. So her first answer is, Moshe was afraid, and so God was telling him, don't be afraid. And in answer to the question, why doesn't it tell us already that Moshe was afraid? It's because even though Moshe is, a person and therefore has fears, the Torah doesn't want to spell that out outright because, we have such reverence for Moshe. We don't want to say that he was afraid. Okay, so out of respect for him. But the suggestion is ruled out by the fact that earlier on in the Pentateuch, earlier on in the Torah, in Exodus chapter 2, we have the following statement describing Moshe's state of mind after he had slain the Egyptian. Vayira Moshe vayomar achein noda davar. Moshe feared and said, surely this thing is known, right? So her answer to her first supposition about why, when God tells Moshe, don't be afraid, why the Torah doesn't tell us that Moshe was afraid. So her first suggestion was because it doesn't want to disrespect Moshe by saying that he was afraid. But in Shemot chapter 2, it does tell us that Moshe is afraid. So it's not that the Torah is unwilling to say such a thing. It is willing to say such a thing. So that can't be the answer to why the Torah doesn't tell us that Moshe was afraid, such that God needs to respond to him, don't be afraid. And by the way, since I don't think we're going to see the answer further down, I think that the reason why at the beginning she gives this little backstory is even perhaps to build on the question, why was Moshe afraid? He had defeated Sichon, king of the Amorites, who had himself defeated Moab. So Moshe had, been already strong and militarily successful, and we have no indication of his fears there. So now he's heading towards Og. Why would he be afraid? Why would God have to tell him not to be afraid? He had already had a significant conquest earlier on in the chapter, earlier on in the, in this short window of time. So then that might be why she gives us that backstory. Okay, why
Isn't
then?
there a midrash that Abraham was afraid that he used up all his schar in one of his battles, or was afraid? That's why he prayed to Hashem.
A midrash, say that again?
That Abraham prayed at some point, and I guess the commentary was like, he knew he was righteous, and why did he have to pray or be afraid? Because he said he thought he used up maybe all his reward or his schar in an earlier battle or challenge.
Is that
ringing a bell?
Yeah, so first we're gonna see a midrash that might be linking to what you're saying. But give me a moment, because I do remember what you're talking about. Hold on, I have my other altiras here. Here it's Breshit 15:1.
It makes me very happy when I can say things and you can know exactly where it is.
All right, hold on. Let's go to this Rashi. Yeah, so I thought that there's 3 reasons given in this midrash. Yeah, so after the War of the 4 Kings and the 5 Kings, in chapter 14, God comes to Avram and says, "Al tira Avram," exact same phraseology. Don't be afraid, Avram. I'm going to protect you. And the question is, similarly here, we weren't told that Avram was afraid. And so the midrash here says, after this miracle had been wrought for him in that he slew the kings, and he was in great anxiety, saying, perhaps I have already received in this God-given victory reward for all my good deeds, right? I've used up all my merit now in this war against the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Therefore, God said to him, don't be afraid. I am your shield against punishment. You will not be punished on account of all of these people whom you have slain. That maybe Abram thought he used up all his merit, and he was going to get punished for the people that he killed in this war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings.
So Moshe similarly could be afraid that he used up all his merit in that first war.
Right. Good. Okay, good possibility. Great. I think I remember there being 3 different opinions. Maybe Rashi's only quoting one of them. But good enough for now. Okay. Why then? So if we've again rejected the possibility that the Torah is unwilling to record Moshe's fears because it's done this in another place, then we have to ask, okay, so why doesn't it do it here? Why then did not the Torah reveal Moses' natural fears of the mighty kings of Canaan and Ar Sidra, if it was willing to do it somewhere else? Maybe argued, of course, it's an interesting of course, that the revelation of Moshe's fears in Egypt applied to the period in his life before he had been spoken to by God. But after Moshe had been entrusted with a divine mission, and attained unprecedented prophetic heights, his character changed, and he was no more subject to such fears. Okay, so her answer is, well, it's very kind of Tosophistic, almost Talmudic of her, to say, okay, well, maybe there's a distinction between the record of Moshe's fears in Shemot chapter 2 and the fact that the Torah doesn't record his fears here in Bamidbar chapter 21. And the reason might be that in chapter 2, Moshe hadn't met God at the burning bush yet. They had not begun to develop their relationship. God had not communicated with Moshe yet. And therefore, he didn't have that direct relationship with the divine, which could bolster his sort of security and change his nature in such a way that he no longer needed to be afraid. So he was afraid in Exodus chapter 2, and maybe he actually, wasn't afraid now. Presumably, then, we may argue that at the outset of his prophetic career, when he hid his face for he was afraid to look upon God, that happened at the burning bush, he was still subject to mortal weaknesses and feared for his life. But, so now she's going to sort of answer an internal question. But if you're going to say that Moshe, once he had built a relationship with God or encountered God, he no longer had these mortal fears because he knew that God was by his side, then how could it be that he expressed fear at the burning bush? And the answer is, well, that was just the very, very beginning. He was just getting to know God. So even in the initial divine encounters, there was fear. But after attaining the prophetic heights of the way God describes just a few Parshiot ago in the story that we studied a little bit about Aharon and Miriam speaking against Moshe about his Cushite wife. And there, when God speaks to them and says, the way I speak to Moshe is different. I speak to him mouth to mouth, not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. He would no fear for flesh and blood, right? So now she's arguing, okay, there was an earlier stage in Moshe's development. There was the first stage when he had not encountered God, he had normal fears. Then he encountered God and he had, some fear of God. But as his relationship developed with God, he no longer had any fears of kind of mortal situations because he knew that God was with him. However, the Torah records explicitly in our Sedra that God exhorted him not to fear, implying that he was still subject to mortal apprehensions of superior might. Right now, it just goes back to her point, which is, okay, all of this would explain a justification for Moshe not to be afraid anymore, but he is, as evidenced by the fact that God tells him, don't be afraid. Even if the Torah doesn't record his fear, it's implied by God's reassurance of him. Why then did not the Torah record for us the fact that Moses was indeed afraid, right? So why does the Torah leave that piece out and just record God's response to it? It would seem that the Torah wished to teach us that human fears cannot be completely eradicated, and that though the prophet overcomes and suppresses them from the eyes of the onlooker, and even possibly from himself, the all-knowing God sees into the innermost recesses of his mind, right? This is a really fascinating, beautiful insight into this little moment where God is coming to him and saying, don't be afraid. And Nechama's question is, so obviously he was afraid. Why doesn't the Torah say first that he was afraid and then that God told him, don't be afraid? Because the Torah wants to teach us that our fears are seen by God, even if we aren't even fully aware of them ourselves, even though we overcome them, or even if we can sort of suppress them so deeply that we're not aware of them, God knows that they're there. Very profound and beautiful reading. Again, we could give a simple or simpler answer, which is just that sometimes the Torah conserves its narrative descriptions, and so it doesn't need to both tell us Moshe was afraid and God told him not to be afraid. It just gets at that point simply by recording that God told him not to be afraid. But she wants to read this more deeply, and so what she's suggesting is the text never records Moshe's fear because Moshe may not even have been aware of his fear. It was so either he had reached such levels of faith or confidence at some level, or he had suppressed it so deeply, but God knew he was afraid. Though it was not therefore plainly evident that Moshe was afraid, God's self, aware of Moshe's innermost feelings, exhorted him not to fear. And I guess, modern psychological lens, I think the power of this is the idea that ultimately it's healthy for us to be attuned to all of our feelings. So God coming along and saying, don't be afraid, is a way of saying both it's okay to discover the fear that's in you. And also I'm reassuring you that you don't have anything, almost not, that the don't be afraid almost doesn't mean don't have fear, but acknowledge the fear that's in you and know that it will be okay. I actually remember Susie Martyr, spouse of Rabbi Chaim Martyr, a pre predecessor of mine at the Bayit and current rabbi at the Hebrew Institute of White Plains. Susie does a lot of parenting consultation and counseling. And I remember Shira and I went to her for a session or two, and we were talking about our children's fears. And she said, she encouraged us to be careful not to use the language of "don't be afraid." Right? We don't want to tell our children that they shouldn't have fears. We can acknowledge their fears and say, "I understand why you're afraid, and how can I help you know that you're going to be okay." So I want to read a little bit the Altira through that lens, that it doesn't mean reject or deny your fears, but actually discover your fears and then don't let your fears rule you. Maybe that's my drash on Nechama's drash or deep reading of this passage.
Receiving a survey of Altira, how often does it say that the main character was actually afraid?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's see if we can pull that up. Hold on. I don't know if I can necessarily tell it here, because this is just the Altira sections. We'd have to go into each one. But on a quick attempt to reconstruct, I don't think it's recorded here in the Avram case. With Hagar, I don't think it explicitly says that she was afraid. Same with Yaakov. And this is, I guess, was Rachel at the birth of Binyamin. Yeah, my sense is it's the same. It's more consistent not to have an indication of the fear, but I'm not sure how consistent it is. So it's a good point. Again, that may cut a little bit against her reading, is my initial thought, that this is just kind of the textual conservatism of language. But it'd be interesting to explore further. Okay. Right, it's interesting. Why does she choose to say it here? Delve into it in this case. Maybe at some level it's the idea of Moshe having fear is more surprising to her than of anybody else. And so that's why perhaps she wants to ask it here.
Yeah.
Okay, nevertheless, it is still surprising that this exhortation was necessary to this point. Surely Moshe, who had brought the Torah down from Mount Sinai, neither eating bread nor drinking water for 40 days, and who had experienced the closest divine communion and triumphed over his mortal desires to such an extent, should not still have been subject to such apprehensions. Let us quote here in explanation of this phenomenon the story retold by Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in his famous commentary to the Mishnah, Tiferet Yisrael, at the end of Kiddushin chapter 4. The Tiferet Yisrael is a fascinating commentary. There's a few other real gems in his commentary. I think somewhere on Pirkei Avot, if I remember right. I don't remember on what Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, but somehow something talking about extraordinary achievement or human beings being created in divine image. Maybe it's the Mishnah on Sanhedrin about one who saves a life is as though he's saved an entire world. I'll see if I can find it and send it to you. He has this amazing commentary where he talks about remarkable human achievements, and he lists all these scientists and philosophers of his day who have made significant contributions, just like a really fascinating little mini aside in his commentary. So a fascinating commentary to read at Tiferet Yisrael. Here's what he says, and I don't remember what the context, I did not check the context in Kiddushin 4. We'll see if we can pick it up also for a follow-up email. When Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, all the peoples of the world trembled and were astonished at the greatness of the man Moses, through whom all these miracles had been performed. Thereupon one Arabian king sent one of his most distinguished painters to paint a likeness of this great leader and bring it to him. The painter executed the portrait and brought it to the king. The king called together all his wise men and asked them to draw conclusions regarding the character and nature of Moses from his portrait. To which the wise men replied, "If we are to judge by the likeness portrayed in this picture, we must conclude that he is wicked, proud, covetous, and perverse, indeed characterized by the worst of human faults." The king was very wroth and indignant and said, "What is this? Do you mock me? Have you not heard about the fame of this great man from all corners of the earth?" Thereupon the king took his chariot and horsemen and set forth for the camp of Israel, where he was astounded to see Moses looking exactly as the painter had portrayed him. The king entered the tent of the man of God and bowed and prostrated himself before him and told Moses all that his wise men had said. And Moses answered and said, "Know that all the faults which your wise men ascribe to me are indeed a part of my nature, and perhaps in greater measure than ascribed to me by your wise men. But through perseverance I have triumphed over them and suppressed them, and for this reason I have become honored in the world." I'll let you digest that for a minute while I take a short break and we're back. Okay, just reading on. Every man, however perfect, is subject to weaknesses and frailties, and his greatness lies rather in his measure of control over them. Moshe thus triumphed over his but mortal fears. However, okay, so this is part one. I should just pause here and say this is part one. The question: why does the text need to tell us that Moshe was afraid, without telling us that imply it by God telling him not to be afraid, without telling us explicitly that he was afraid? We had some of our alternative possibilities. She suggests maybe, that it's because the text never wants to acknowledge Moshe's fears, but it does do it in Shemot. Then she suggests, well, maybe it only would acknowledge his fears then, but once he had developed this close relationship with God, then he wouldn't be afraid anymore. But the implication of our verse itself is that he is still afraid. And so the teaching is that sometimes we're not even aware of our fears, but God is and responds to them, and in so doing kind of awakens us to them and invites us to encounter them in some way. And no amount of relationship with God necessarily changes our human makeup ultimately, but sometimes, in fact, gives us the tools to wrestle with that human condition better. And that was part of Moshe's greatness, as described by this parable. He had all human flaws and faults, but through perseverance, he was able to overcome them a certain way. It's a really, really fascinating parable, I think. Okay, now she shifts for a moment to a second dimension of this reading. However, she writes, the phrase, and this is just so classic Nechama, I think, in the way the layout is done here. Maybe it's the way the editors do it. And I don't know if this is sort of two different analyses of hers that have been put together here by our editors, because we're moving to a different dimension of reading without even a paragraph break. However, the phrase alluding to his fears will repay closer study. So if we take a closer look at it, we'll be rewarded. It's evident that it is no ordinary fear that's referred to in our Sidra. Here, the Hebrew verb to fear is used in a transitive sense with a direct object, him, oto, right? Our verse was, God said to Moshe, Al tira oto, do not be afraid of him. That's how it's translated here. And not intransitively with the direct object because of him, mipanav, right? There could be two ways to talk about this reassurance. Al tira oto, don't fear him, and al tira mipanav, don't have fear, don't be afraid from him, almost, right? So because of him, or al tira mipanav, which we may translate as be not afraid of him. And she cites an example of, al tira or lo tira mipneihem. I don't know if that's on my list. Let's see. Yeah. Al tira'u mipneihem, in plural. Don't be afraid of them because of them. Our commentators have explained, and this triggered some memory in me that we might have even seen this together over the course of this year, this distinction between two kinds of fears, but I couldn't remember where it was. So if you remember, let me know. Our commentators have explained that fear in the intransitive sense implies physical terror of the might of the enemy, while fear in the transitive sense implies to stand in awe. Okay, so fear in the intransitive sense, that's the mipanav, that's physical terror. Fear in the transitive sense, the al tira oto, is actually stand in awe. So now we're already going to begin to translate our actual verse here that Moshe is being reassured by God in a different way. It is usually used with reference to the fear of God. Et Hashem Elokecha tira, you should fear the Lord your God. And the respect due to parents, which is compared by the Torah to the fear of heaven. Ish imo va'aviv tira'u. And with regard to man and his neighbor, when respect is mixed with fear. Rashi points this out in his comment on the verse Al Tira'oto. So now we're circling back to our pasuk. Rashi's comment. Al Tira'oto. Shaya Moshe yarei lihilachem. Moshe was afraid of fighting Og. Shema Tamod, this is where I think it might have hyperlinked with James's point. Shema Tamod lo la'og zechuto shel Avraham. Shne'emar vayavo hapalit vayaged la'Avram hu Og. And Moshe was afraid of fighting Og, lest Og be protected by the merit of Avraham. And this is where it connects to that verse we were looking at earlier. In the beginning of chapter 15, we were looking at God saying to Avraham, don't be afraid. That was after the War of the Four Kings and the Five Kings, which was sort of kicked off by someone coming to tell Avraham that Lot had been captured. And that palit, that refugee who came to tell Avraham, the Midrash suggests, was Og. Okay, so Og had, according to the Midrash, been the one who came to tell Avraham that Lot was captured. That accrued a great merit to him. And again, in the Midrashic imagination, in which that's the same Og who's still around that Moshe is fighting against now, Moshe was afraid to fight him because maybe that merit of Avraham, through having done this act of kindness to Avraham, would stand to Og's protection, and Moshe was concerned about battling him. Right? We're not here concerned with the identification by the Midrash of the survivor that came to tell Avraham of the plight of Lot with Og, meaning leaving that question, why or how do we know that the anonymous, refugee or survivor was Og? We're leaving that to the side for now. What is concerning us is the concept of the meritorious actions that may stand to the credit of even a wicked man, right? The idea that even the evil king Og could have merit. Though he may seem to us to be completely devoid of good deeds, the Almighty who sees into the human heart may find even in such a man merit, and will not begrudge him his reward. It is impossible, therefore, for one human being to judge the character of another and appraise his moral worth. This only the Almighty can do, right? So here's just sort of saying, right, therefore, going back a step, what did all this have to do with the transitive versus intransitive? right? The Rashi's comment is based on the insight that she's pointed out to us, the grammatical insight, that al tira oto, as opposed to al tira mi panav, not don't be afraid because of him, but actually don't stand in awe of him is more the better translation. Why would that make sense about Og? Because Og actually may have had some really special character or protection that was coming to his defense, which would be a reason that Moshe wouldn't necessarily need to be afraid of the fury of Og, but afraid of the greatness of Og that would stand to Og's protection. And as a result, we're learning this lesson here, which is that someone who may seem to us to be completely devoid of good deeds, the Almighty who sees into the human heart may find even in such a man merit and not begrudge him his reward. While she doesn't make the connection explicitly here, by the way, it seems to me like at some level, these are sort of the two pieces of her interpretation are kind of complementary, right? Essentially, the first piece of her interpretation is saying, Moshe was a person who was deeply flawed, like all human beings, and in a great person, don't deny the possibility that they have profound challenges that they've overcome. And here she's almost sort of saying in the flip that in a person who we perceive as evil or wicked, don't rule out the possibility that they've done great deeds and have merit accruing to them that we may not be aware of, right? So just, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the sort of two different interpretations, hinge on the opposite dimensions of the same idea, which is how little we can necessarily understand about a person just from face value. Right, so judging the character of another and appraising their moral worth, this only the Almighty can do. Our sages stated, judge every man charitably. Maimonides in the Laws of Tshuva, chapter 3, verse 2, speaks in the same strain. A person whose iniquities outweigh his meritorious deeds dies forthwith on account of his wickedness. And it's worth looking at the note here, which says, should it be argued that we witness so many wicked men who live long and prosperous lives, we should realize, as the Rambam remarks subsequently, that the account of good and evil is not calculated mathematically, and the evildoer concerned may have some hidden merit to his credit. Another explanation suggested is that Maimonides refers to the reckoning made at man's death, right? That when it says here, he'll die forthwith, means like his, at his death and his time of ultimate judgment, there's sort of an immediate punishment. So it is with the city whose iniquities are excessive. Forthwith it's destroyed. As is stated, the cry of Sodom and Amorah is great, literally much. It was Rabbah, their cry, implying their sins were more than their good deeds. So it is with the whole of mankind. If their iniquities exceeded their meritorious actions, forthwith they are destroyed. As it is stated, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great. This is in the end of Breshit, leading to the destruction of the world at Noach. This calculation is not based on a quantitative reckoning of good and bad deeds, but on a qualitative reckoning. One meritorious action may outweigh many iniquities, as it is stated, because there was found in him one worthy deed. On the other hand, one iniquity may outweigh many meritorious deeds, as it is stated, one sinner or sin destroys much good in Kohelet. But the reckoning is made in accordance with the judgment of the divine arbiter, and only God knows how the balance sheet of merits and iniquities is drawn up. So we kind of wind off with a relatively homiletical, sermonic reflection here about how little we are able to ultimately judge the merits or demerits of another. All of this built out of this little phrase of Al Tira, which God says to Moshe. Questions, comments, or reactions? Okay. Feel free to digest and take it with you for this lengthy double Parsha. There are many more wonderful essays, and we will continue on for just a few more weeks till the end of Bamidbar, and then plan to take our summer hiatus for Dvarim as things stand now. So thanks, everybody. Great to learn together. Hope you enjoyed, and see you next week. Love to Mom and Dad. Sorry we couldn't see you guys. Hope your computer and phone are okay. And good night to all. Bye.